So what I thought I'd talk about today are some thoughts I've had recently about topicality, and it's going to take me a few moves to get there, so bear with me. The first thing I want to say is that topicality is important, and that one of the good outcomes for debating would be for us to have an understanding of topicality that lets us have healthy topicality debates and get the benefit of actually debating topicality and not shying away from it. When I was in college, one of my teammates was one of the best researchers in the United States, and at the end of his senior year, he won the national debate tournament, and he was just absolutely legendary for being able to go to the library, and our joke was that he would just hold out his hands to the bookshelves, and the evidence just flew into his hands. But people were in awe of him all over the country for his ability to debate on the merits, and it didn't matter what affirmative he was debating, he was ready to go deep on the substance. And for that reason, he really, really hated debating topicality. He would avoid it if he possibly could. He did the 2N, and even in situations where they probably could have won on topicality, his partner couldn't talk him into going for it. Well, then he went to law school. And not even after, but in his first year of law school, he came back and he told me that, for all the successful former debaters who go on to law school, there really needs to be more topicality debating, because he said the overwhelming amount of what goes on in the law, the overwhelming volume of the argumentation really has more in common with topicality than it has to do with debating the substance in any competitive debate, that most of the cases that come to court are really not settled on the merits, they're really settled based on the definitions and on the interpretive issues, and if he had paid more attention and honed his abilities as a topicality debater, it really would have prepared him better to be an attorney. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who debates is going to go on to law school. As a matter of fact, one of my own little private opinions is I think we send too many former debaters on to law school. But I am an academic who studies argumentation, and having done that for, coming up on 20 years or so, it really is the case, it's my sense, that almost all important, difficult public controversies that we deal with collectively, in most cases it has more to do with what are the definitions and what are the proper interpretations than what are the merits. So, with that in mind, I know that there are pockets of the debate world, there are local debate communities where topicality debating is kept to a minimum, where people think of it as a bad thing if a topicality debate breaks out, that there are likely to be hurt feelings, and that debaters who run topicality strategically because it's an argument that they think that they can win, that they're doing something wrong, and that you should only run topicality as a last resort. And I think that that is a suboptimal educational outcome. I think part of what debate needs to do is it needs to teach us how to think about topicality and how not to feel shy or regretful about introducing the issue. So, I'm gonna go on now and talk about how we do debate topicality, and how I think, unfortunately, the way we currently debate topicality kind of locks us in to thinking about it that way. What we tend to do, I think most people agree that topicality as an issue needs to exist. That if the affirmative shows up and their opening move to set up the debate, to give the negative something to respond to, if that is not squarely within the bounds of the topic, then there needs to be a consequence. And where it is egregious, it needs to be that they need to lose the debate. But we have to go to all these ends. We have to develop these really sort of elaborate understandings of how topicality works and why topicality is important, almost to give the judge a pep talk to pull the trigger and cast a negative ballot on topicality. So we have to talk about impact arguments. We have to talk about topicality as a voting issue for reasons of education, for reasons of prior notice, protecting negative ground. And that's the first thing I want to talk about. We try to explain topicality by impacting what happens if there's not a negative vote on topicality in any given debate where the issue's been introduced. And I'm sorry, but most of those arguments are kind of silly. Because what you have to do is you have to have grossly exaggerated cases of non-topical affirmatives for those arguments to be remotely true. I mean, when you say that allowing non-topical affirmatives destroys education, well, I mean, it would really have to be way out there in left field. Like, they would have to ratify the law of the sea, or they would have to send a human crewed mission to Mars or something like that on one of your topics this year for it to be such a non sequitur and have so little to do with to provide so little starting point for the negative that it really became an exercise in futility and there was no educational value. And I can count on the fingers of one hand the time I've seen that happen in an actual debate. Usually they have a lot to do with the subject matter. What they bring to the debate, their plan, has enough overlap with what everybody else is doing that really you could take some of your strategies and you could tinker something together. It's just not in the mainstream of the topic. And I go back to something that I saw happen at the National Debate Tournament my senior year in college. There was this really, really excellent team from the University of Redlands, and this is back in a period of time when in college debate it was generally accepted that the topics and the judging conventions had kind of tilted things in favor of the affirmative. And we had around a 70% affirmative win percentage at that time. And really good debaters, they would just assume if they went to an 8-round tournament that they'd win all 4 of their affirmatives and then try to figure out how are we going to pick up maybe 1, 2, or 3 negative wins. And they would put all of their ingenuity into trying to pry loose those negative wins because they were really hard to come by. But this University of Redlands team, they were frighteningly good on the negative, and what they did, they won every elim at the National Debate Tournament, octafinals, quarters, semis, and the final round on the negative, and in 3 of those 4 debates they debated new affirmatives. Which means no prior notice, no on-point strategy for what they debated. Now, if you really believe those impacts to topicality, then you must believe that what they did was poor debating. Well, really what I've seen is that they won a lot of people's respect, that people thought that was fine debating. What they did is they improvised. Within the 2 hours they had, they thought laterally, they went into their very deep research, they thought based on all the education they'd had over the years, how to respond to different situations, and they put together a devastatingly effective strategy in each of those debates, and they did it quickly, and they did it cooperatively, and I would say that the opportunity for them to be faced by that challenge was unbelievably educational, which turns the whole argument on its head. Now, am I saying topicality is something that we don't need, or am I in favor of topicality as not a voting issue arguments? No, I'm not in favor of that at all, but I think that one of the reasons that so many people, so many judges in particular, are uncomfortable voting on topicality has to do with the fact that there's just a little bit of absurdity at the core of those arguments. That if there's something in the topic that you're supposed to do and the affirmative is finessing it, if there's some way they deviate a little bit from what the topic directs them to do, that destroys education. We don't have any prior notice. Well, no, it doesn't. It may mean that you need to adjust your strategy a little bit. It may mean you need to think on the fly. It may mean that you need to get off your generics and get off your scripted strategy and actually respond to what was said. But it doesn't mean that the debate has been stripped of any educational value. And I'm going to stop and I'm going to insert one grumble here. I would find it easier to believe all the arguments about prior notice and education and so forth if I looked at the team policy topics that are kind of the history in the homeschool leagues, and if they actually directed you to do anything. The people who write these topics have such a taste for broad, non-directive topics that I think, well, how do you violate that? How in the world could you lose a topicality debate with a topic that amounts to resolve, do something about Russia, resolve, do something about the criminal justice system? We're reading a lot about the internet. That must be trendy. Resolved, something, 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 internet. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, and I hope I don't step on people's toes too terribly much. But that reality, in some ways, that also makes topicality arguments like believing 5 impossible things before breakfast. So that's the first problem. I think when we impact topicality, we make implausible arguments. Now, what some people do is that the approach is a little bit different, that the topicality as an argument is not explained by the impact if the burden is not imposed, but it's explained by way of analogy. And the analogy argument I don't hear as often. I think it's got a bit worn out because there are some easy questions to ask about it, and also because I think it sets up some of people's discomfort with topicality debating. The analogy is jurisdiction. So the analogy is to a court. And courts have subject matter jurisdiction. It's more true of federal courts than of state courts, but courts tend to have jurisdiction here certain kinds of cases, and if you bring a case that doesn't fall within their jurisdiction, doesn't matter what the merits, doesn't matter how urgent the case is, they have to dismiss it. Well, the reality is most courts have very broad subject matter jurisdiction. Most state-level courts have jurisdiction over any controversy that comes through the door, And judges will even grant threshold jurisdiction. They'll let the proceeding continue just based on your assertion that a case has certain implications or certain effects. They may later have to go back and review that, but then you get into the very tangled up question of, for the debate to go forward, for a debate to be educational, does the affirmative have to meet the burden of threshold jurisdiction, or does it have to be so squarely within the judge's jurisdiction that it would pass appellate review? So that's a point at which the analogy just gets kind of labored, which is why I think that the analogy is not used that often. If you've ever heard topicality called a jurisdictional issue, that's what they're referring to. But really more often I hear the impact-style arguments made than the analogy arguments. But there's one more thing I want to say about that analogy. And I got to thinking about all of this. I got the idea to make this entire video because of something that happened in my debate class that I teach here at Northwest Christian this week. This was the week that we were going over how to debate topicality and procedurals, and one of the students in my class, he's a non-traditional student, he's in his early 30s, and he's worked for several years as a police officer, and he was just not into this argument at all, and complaining about it, and I finally said, Johnny, I can tell you don't like this issue, what's going on? And he said, it just feels to me like when you arrest a criminal, and the criminal gets off on a technicality. It seems like that's what this argument is, just a technicality. And I've heard judges say that, and I've heard debaters look down on other debaters who did a lot of topicality debating, and I've heard them call it a cheap shot. And I think that there is a little bit of this sense that it is like winning on a cheap shot, on a technicality. And so one of the larger lessons about how debate works that I want to insert right here is a lot of the time winning debates is not about being right on the merits. What can make the biggest difference of all is how are you packaging the arguments. And so, in the middle of this class, while I'm trying to explain this very important, very necessary, and very uncomfortable issue to this student of mine who has worked as a police officer and doesn't like to see criminals get off on technicalities, I thought, what's another way that I could explain it? And this idea popped into my head, and I explained it to him a different way, and he was a lot more comfortable with it. And it's a different way of arguing topicality by analogy that I want to suggest to you. These are still very rough ideas. They're only a few days old, and I'm sure I'm going to refine this idea as my debaters use it in debates and as I think more about it in my spare time, but here's kind of the rough cut of it. I said, I want you to think about NCAA eligibility rules, and we're right across the street from the University of Oregon, and they just played in the Pac-12 championship, so they're off to the Rose Bowl, so everyone's excited about that. So I said to Johnny, what happens if the Oregon Ducks play with a player who didn't make grades? And he thought about it for a second, and he said, they have to forfeit the game. And I said, yes. Topicality, the argument you're making, is that the affirmative has an ineligible plan. That the topic is a published rule of eligibility. And there are other offenses that sports teams can commit under NCAA rules. They can pay their players, they can commit recruiting violations. Those will result in punitive sanctions. There'll be an investigation. The program could have a bowl ban to where they can't play in any postseason bowls. They could forfeit the right to give athletic scholarships. They could even have their program pretty much shut down the way Southern Methodist University had happened to them back in the late 1980s. But when it comes to playing a player who hasn't made grades, a player who's just not eligible, and it tends to be the same if it's a player who's not enrolled as a full-time student, what happens most of the time, and I speak with some knowledge of this because I'm Northwest Christian University's faculty athletic representative, what the league will do is the league simply makes them forfeit any games where that ineligible player played. Now, any games where the ineligible player did not play, they win. And furthermore, it doesn't matter if the game went forward, and it doesn't matter how many points the team scored. If there's one ineligible player, all those games are forfeited. And this, for Johnny, was a very comfortable way of thinking about topicality. Your plan is simply ineligible. And one of the things that's kind of nice about it is you don't have to think about it as punitive, you can think about it as corrective. Because I can tell you that these athletic leagues, their purpose, they do believe in coming down with punitive sanctions when there are improprieties dealing with money, when there are improprieties dealing with recruiting and poaching the talent from other teams. But when it comes to something as simple as was the player making grades, was the player enrolled in enough classes, all they want you to do is fix it. What they're trying to do is they're trying to cultivate a culture which encourages students to make good, solid academic progress. Ideally, they'd like it to be a culture of academic excellence, to where these are not just athletes, they're scholar athletes. But one commitment they've made is they will not wait until it is a crisis before they act. They act at the first sign of trouble, which is to say, they act when one player whose GPA, if there's one player with a GPA below, say, a 2, which I believe is, I should know, you would think, given the faculty athletic rep job. But if their GPA falls below what's acceptable, they're benched instantly. And if one player goes out on the field, if one player goes out on the floor, and they're not making grades, the game is forfeit. But as soon as you bench them, you're fine again. And what they're saying is, really, I think you could take this analogy and you could translate it, you could transfer it pretty neatly to topicality debating, and you could say, we don't have to wait until the activity is falling apart. We don't have to make any floodgates type arguments. We can say what we're trying to do is we're trying to promote a culture of clash and excellence. We're trying to say each plan has to be squarely within the bounds of the topic, properly interpreted with a better interpretation, and that any affirmative team that is running an ineligible plan, all they do is, it doesn't matter what the merits are, it doesn't matter how good of an idea it is, it doesn't matter strategically how elegant or nifty it is, that they simply have to forfeit those games until they show up with an eligible plan. And really, I think this is more a question of packaging than anything else. I think that it does feel, when you use the courtroom analogy, like you're dealing with the kind of technicality, the kind of getting off on a technicality horror stories that you've heard over the years. And I think that if you had a way to borrow a slightly closer analogy, because, you know, NCAA eligibility rules, those are the rules governing competition in a league that is affiliated with an educational institution, which means the analogy to debate is much, much closer than a courtroom analogy. When you don't have to make these impact arguments about debate falling apart that are fundamentally hard to believe, it just seems to me like this is an approach to debating topicality that has a lot more promise. So that's the introductory version of it for you to take and do as you will and think about, and you might be the first person in your part of the country to run a topicality argument and then simply to impact it by saying the plan is ineligible. The topic, we see the topic as a posted eligibility restriction, and so therefore they should forfeit any debates in which they run an ineligible plan the same way a team would forfeit any games played with an ineligible player. And you can go on into the second line explanations if necessary, if they challenge that later on in the debate. So think on those things, and we'll see if this idea has any utility.